It's the 5th week of work on the roof, and the last 4 videos have started with me worrying about the weather. But with the roof now covered and ready for the next layers, and with the weather forecasted to be warm and sunny, what could possibly go wrong? Well, on Monday morning, I didn't think much could go wrong. The weekend had been dry after a storm had eventually swept through on Friday evening, a couple of hours after we had finished our precautionary indoor day last week. And with a hint of morning sun outside and things looking dry inside, it looked like a good day to be putting the next layers on the roof. Especially after getting some new soles and laces into my work shoes. With 3 of the team on site, they got ready to remove the plastic sheets, while the drain specialist dropped in to measure the run for the new gutters. Haggy then arrived with some more materials. And I started clearing some space for our next bit of work, which was to be the lifting onto the roof of the Kingspan TA41 insulation panels we had picked up 2 weeks ago. Without a crane on site, we decided it would be quicker to open the packets down below and pass the 10cm thick panels up by hand and lay them straight out where we wanted them. And with the initial batch, we were able to very quickly link the panels using the tongue and groove connections all around the edges. I then had to be off-site briefly, and by the time I was back, the team were making good progress, which was reassuring because the sun had now gone and the weather forecast was now suggesting there might be some rain later in the afternoon. But with the first half installed easily, we removed the remaining plastic rain sheets and cleaned the brickboard tops to get ready to lift up the next batch of panels. Where once again I chose the starting point in the chain so that I could set the pace. And with the necessary panels above, everything was moving along nicely. But at this stage, we were only lining the panels up and not finalizing their positions and sealing the connections. As we were reaching the end and cutting some final panels into shape, it was getting dark and rumbles of thunder could be heard. And when Haggy was filling the ridge space with insulation foam, the raindrops had started to fall. And pretty soon it had turned into a full-on rainstorm. And I made a very quick dash down the hill to pick up some materials. When I was back on site and saw the amount of water coming through the panels in their provisional place and through the brick boards below them, I went above to see what could be done. And with the rain lessening slightly, we put the plastic covers back on again in case the rain got heavier. So after the overcaution on Friday, I had now got it wrong on the other end of the scale. And with the forecast now showing solid rain for the next 8 hours, we reverted to indoor work, even though it now wasn't actually raining. With Haggy returning to the wall he built up last week, and Miguel working on some repair work on the salon wall, while I grabbed a very late lunch. And then changed my shoes and socks after my new soles and laces had been completely soaked. In building up the downstairs wall, we had purposefully left a cavity that we had intended to insulate later on. But we now had an opportunity to test the adaptability of the Kingspan insulation, as the TA41 model that we were using is purposefully designed for multiple applications. So we were now using the same 10 centimeter thick panels in the wall as well as on the roof. And it was an almost perfect fit for the cavity. Oh, yeah. And then with some quick marking and cutting, Haggy and Sam were able to click the panels into place across the whole cavity span. And with some insulation foam around the edges and contact points, everything was nicely sealed in. Miguel had made good progress preparing the wall for some repair work later on. And Lou had done a good job at clearing the remaining rubble upstairs. Muy bien. So while it wasn't the day we had envisaged, we had at least got quite a lot done. When I arrived on day 2, everything was still pretty damp. There were plenty of puddles outside, and upstairs I was fearing the worst. But thankfully the covers had worked, and we just needed to get some windows open to blow out any dampness. While up above, we were back to removing covers and checking on the insulation panels, which had definitely passed their unplanned waterproof test. Although before doing any more work on them, we wanted to remove the water on top, ideally with a mop that I couldn't initially find, and make sure the surface was totally dry. And while I was on drying duty, the team put up scaffolding that they would need for some wall work coming up later on this week. And while we waited for a full dry out, I did some cleaning around the connection with the Phase 1 roof and some of the insulation foam from the day before. Down below, the scaffolding was up, and by the mid-morning break, we decided the panels were dry enough for some readjusting from any movement during the rain. I had agreed to do one side, and I stole a head start on Haggy and Miguel during their break, as I needed to head off site later on. Haggy and Miguel got their side sorted pretty quickly, and soon we were all taping the panel connection points for some extra sealing. And with the taping almost complete, I headed out briefly and left the team to finish some work on the panels and get started with the next layer. And when I was back, the team were now putting in place a waterproof layer made of overlapping sheets of impermeable membrane, which, with the breeze that was blowing, was going to be easier to put in with an extra pair of hands. On the second side, we started from the lower end first, which I think was slightly easier and faster, but not quite quick enough for us to get another roll on site, especially as we needed some time to add tiles to weigh down the sheets. So we would be leaving a very small gap between the sheets overnight, which our combined weather app suggested wouldn't be a problem. And the late afternoon sun didn't suggest any problems either. So after a bit of tidying up below, I left without any real concerns. But on day 3, I returned with some concerns after another surprise storm swept through the area late at night, and the roads and ground were all still pretty damp. Upstairs, everything looked dry, so the membrane had done its job. But I then climbed up to check on the small gap we had left overnight. Where some rain had entered, and there was a small amount of water on all the surfaces, which we were going to need to dry off before adding the next layers. And after the hot sun the afternoon before, I also needed some extra protection layers before the day's work. And having found the mops, the surfaces were dried pretty quickly, and the team could start putting on the next layer, which was a thin layer of corrugated XPS insulation board, which the team wanted to have in place to hold the mortar that would be needed for the tiles above. By the mid-morning break, one half was complete, and the final section for the waterproof membrane was sufficiently dried out. So after the break, we were back above to fasten the final strip of membrane. And then to smooth out the membrane and tape. Before adding the XPS layer, which I left to Haggy and Miguel as I returned to water duties for mortar that would soon be needed. With some quick phone calls while I waited for bidons to fill, before then refilling the deposit. Back up above, the next layers were in place and the focus was switching to the cornices, which now needed to be built up to the height of the panels we had just added. And I left this to the team and headed down to sort and dry out the plastic covers just in case they were going to be needed again. Sam and Alu were still working hard on the mortar line, and Haggy and Miguel were steadily building up the cornice. One of them working on each side, with Miguel's work on the front requiring slightly more tiles to be added on top of a brick layer. With no rain overnight and a sunny morning, day 4 started without any of the more recent worries. And when the team were on site, Sam got set up for a big day of mortar supply, as the main focus for the day was to finish the cornice work along the front and back. But to work on the end, the team needed to adjust the scaffolding with planks that Alu and I needed to collect. And while I followed the initial cornice work, I did some prep work for the next layers on the roof, first trimming the insulation foam along the ridge, and then starting the long process of moving the old tiles that we would be reusing. A first bit of work on the cornice was to fill in with mortar behind the newly added layers. I then dropped below for a fairly long meeting with the Technico to discuss the roof work and the next phases of work. And then we also talked about some local cycling routes. After the meeting, I had to head out for some bank admin at the local branch, checking in on progress en route. And when I was back a little later, I was back above to discuss with the team the exact finish on the corner points of the cornice. I was then briefly back on water duty, where I was reminded that the old temporary drain would not be needed at the back. And then it was time for a first lunch in a while under the shade of the tree. After lunch, it was back to the tile moving while following cornice work progress. And then enjoying Haggie's response to a gecko.
Campaña. Aquí no, dentro no. ¿Dónde está?
ambient. Els nostres plats els elaborem amb ingredients ecològics i de petits productors. Som el restaurant.
On Friday morning, it was warm and sunny, and it felt like summer had returned, or perhaps it had arrived. And after finishing the main work on the cornice, the team would be starting work on the final tile layer.
Los lunes. Vamos a casa hoy.
Rex was very kindly back and straight into action, making the main door slightly more accessible, while up above Haggy was preparing the church end of the roof for a first line of tiles. At this endpoint, the team would be adding 2 layers of tiles, and the first line was in place pretty quickly. While Rex was now clearing another access route, this time on the path down the side of the garden, which we might need to use in the coming weeks. By the mid-morning break, it was a hot day, and the tree felt a bit like an outside cafe. More butterflies were out and about, and Rex was soon back on the path, and the team working on the second tile there at the roof end. Sam was working hard to provide a constant supply of mortar to above. And with one end line complete, the team had moved to the other end and the connection with the phase 1 part of the roof work. Rex had done an excellent job on the path, and with the machine out, I cut back a bit more of the path. Before heading back for a drink. checking on progress. And then some lunch. After which I finished some of the rubber work. And then separated out some stones for some work I want to do next week. With both ends in place, the team had marked up the intended lines of tiles in between and were now working on the first of these.
Bagman.
In the last hour, Sam was tidying up for the last time this week. And the team were working their way through the last buckets of mortar. And that is the end of work for this week, during which Sam has been particularly busy in this area, lifting various materials up above, especially mortar for the new cornices, which are now all ready for the new gutters next week. But the bigger change this week have been the new layers that have been put in between taking off, putting back on, and then taking off again the plastic rain sheets. And after my series of very bad decisions in relation to the weather, I think I might just stop talking about the forecast as we move on to the big tile phase of the roof work. But please do tune in again next week to see how we get on.